He was the boldest man I ever knew. He feared nothing. By turns, Schwartz was hunted by American bishops, Korean bishops, a murderous kingpin, a gang of lepers, and his own seminary rector. And each time he passed right through their midst. I think he was not even afraid of God, Filipino Bishop Socrates Villegas said, because perfect love casts out all fear. So this is a pretty special episode of the greats. When I think of the greats, this is definitely one of those that comes to mind. It's Venerable Aloysius Schwartz, or Father Al, as he was known, is still known to thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of orphans that he saved from the streets, he and his sisters of Mary. This is a man who he founded the Sisters of Mary. Together they founded World Villages for Children, which has boys' towns and girls' towns. It's a special place. I took my whole family down to Girls Town just this past year. I went with some of my my father-in-law and some buddies to Boys Town in Guadalajara. So the World Villages for Children at every boys' town and girls' town, all the children have either lost one sibling to starvation or have been trafficked, or both. So the boys' towns and girls' towns in the world, I think there are about 14 total now, in Korea, the Philippines, Latin America, and now Africa. They provide more beds. They shelter more children from human trafficking and victims of human trafficking than any other institution on the planet. Father Al didn't just start another orphanage, didn't just start another order of priests or nuns. He created what is perhaps the greatest orphan relief program in the history of the world. So we produced with Kevin Wells, the author of Priest and Beggar, the book that we're going to be talking about tonight. The author of that book and I have become friends. We've gone down to Girlstown together with my family. And we also helped Voyage Comics produce a comic that's just coming out about Father Al's life called Fear Nothing. Fear Nothing, we get that title from that quote that I started the podcast with. This is a comic book for children of the world to read and get saints as their heroes. It's a comic against bullying because Father Al had to fight so many bullies in his life. Some of those I just mentioned in that quote, American bishops, Korean bishops, Kingpin, just like I'm going to reference Daredevil, like the Kingpin. This guy was very much like the Kingpin from the comics. A gang of lepers, his own seminary rector. It's time after time, he confronted huge obstacles, violent obstacles. And so we made this comic book about him fighting off bullies. And the last bully that he had to face was his own mortality. He was diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, and he died a really harrowing, really painful, torturous death. A death that he likened as humbly as possible to Christ's own. And so this episode will be about his life, and the next episode will be about his death. And for that second episode, we will focus on his book, his own autobiography of his passion and death. That book is called Killing Me Softly. So when Kevin and I were working on that comic book, Father Al, Fear Nothing, we went to the home of Father Al's father, Louis Schwartz. This place was Pigtown. It's a place in Baltimore, not far from the wharf and the docks. It's described, and Kevin Wells is an amazing writer. The book I'm going to be quoting from for this episode is Priest and Beggar, which is a title that Kevin Wells will use for himself in a letter that we'll get to tonight. And it's going to be a joy because Kevin Wells is such a great writer. I'll quote from his book extensively. And he has just wonderful visuals. So he describes Pigtown, where Louis Schwartz grew up. And what we're getting at here is that Father Al experienced a lot of poverty in his life, in his childhood. And then we're going to see a theme throughout his life of trying to live authentically poor, trying to live authentically in solidarity with the poor. So he is going to search through a couple different orders and priesthood options, vocations within the priesthood to find the most arduous, the most authentic poverty. But he knew poverty growing up. So Pigtown, where his dad was from, coagulated blood clung to the air like incense as he played stickball in the cobblestone alleys outside his home. Lewis is going to grow up just down the street from George Herman Ruth, Babe Ruth. This is, if you've ever been to the Babe Ruth Museum, that's Pigtown. That's right where he grew up. His parents had an interesting courtship, and that pointed to Father Al's future missionary work. But before that, Lewis's father enlisted in the U.S. Navy. He was on a minesweeper, spent long days fishing out old German mines from British sea lanes, and it must have been grueling work for him. When his children would later ask him about this experience, he'd just have this cast faraway glances of his time in the war. So he settled, when he came back from Navy, he settled in Washington, D.C. We're still talking about Lewis, Father Al's father, and he met Sedalia Bourassa. She's from Montana. So that's kind of an interesting combination. A wharf rat from Baltimore, and a woman, a rugged Montana woman, that these people are going to come together, both strong Catholics, and forge Father Al. It's said that the only reason Sedalia allowed Lewis to court her was because Lewis was the only man who would agree to accompany her to the evening novena at the church St. Francis Xavier. It was a red brick Jesuit church on North Capitol in Washington, D.C. The name of the church was St. Aloysius. They'd say a weekly novena to St. Francis at this church. And St. Francis Xavier, so it's a Jesuit church. They're saying novena, St. Francis Xavier, patron of the missions. And the name of the church they're going to eventually name their son Aloysius for this church, St. Aloysius in D.C. Sedalia noted in a diary, they found this diary when she died in 1946, she always had a special devotion to St. Francis Xavier, patron saint of foreign missionaries. She had committed herself to his novena of grace for 21 consecutive years. And the novena booklet was written, "Those who help Catholic missionaries by their prayers and alms are carrying on the work for which St. Francis lived, suffered, and died." And she'd pray at St. Aloysius Church, and then her son, Father Aloysius, Venerable Aloysius, would go on to be a great missionary in Asia. So if you think novenas and prayers don't work for your children, let Sedalia's example correct that. So speaking of his childhood poverty, Father Al's father, Lewis, is going to fall sick, and he's going to be unable to work for a year. So Father Al, little Al, and his brother Lewis are going to have to pick up the slack, assist the family financially, add some paper routes. This period of silent sorrow is pivotal to understanding Al's childhood formation. Between 1941 and 42, in the thick of World War II, his adolescent eyes witnessed firsthand the anguish of the human condition and the untamed desolation of poverty. The unpredictability of these days bore on Al for the remainder of his life. It was a time when God's face seemed to turn away. But in the midst of all this, he had some heroes. His heroes began with comic book heroes. And this is part of the reason why we felt compelled to write a comic about Father Al, is he had this comic called the Boy Commandos. It's described the DC Comics sensation came in the mail periodically from his Uncle Al, who owned a 5 and dime store in Fargo, North Dakota. And it became Little Al's multicolored secular Bible. He saw the Commandos as saviors of mankind, an international cast of daring, orphaned boys. That's going to be significant to his life. André Chavard from France, Alfie Twidget from England, Jan Hassan from the Netherlands, and Brooklyn from the United States, who together boldly took on Hitler and the Nazis. They spoke to his imagination in an intensely personal way. As he flipped pages, Al inconspicuously deposited himself into the stories as a fifth orphan, secretly joining them on another dire circumstance in Hitlertown and Naziville. When the foursome yet again saved the day, Al imagined that one day he might do his part as well. And he asked himself, even then, are priests able to save this way? So the idea of becoming a priest really started growing in little Al's head. And, this is a boy who's going to be secretly celebrating the Mass in his basement. Lewis's little Al's father, Lewis, his sister was Sister Mary Melfrieda. She was I think a religious sister there in D.C., and so they'd go and visit her. This is a quote, she sat on the porch of her convent at one of the highest points in town awaiting them. Dad's bald tires would start spinning out climbing that hill. This is all from Al's brother, Louis Jr. Dad's bald tires would start spinning out climbing that hill. With all of us in there, we would always struggle to even make it up that hill, Lou remembered. Sister Melfrieda was a fully habited missionary with the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur. Her disposal, her meekness, wit, piety, and Germanic backbone, she put all her gifts, all her charisms at her disposal to educate her destitute black students as a teacher at Our Lady of Perpetual Help Mission on Morse Road, which was situated a mile from the old home of abolitionist Frederick Douglass. When Al listened at her feet, he felt he was sitting at the balcony of a queen, and she awoke in his heart a yearning, a whole new world of yearning for Christ and to know Christ. Father Al began to see her work as not as the world would see it. A revolution took place in Al's mind. Serving the poor in the slums was not an obscenity. It was the privileged path to entering the life of Christ in the Gospels. Christ chose the poor. To work for the societally disregarded was to share in his thinking. His aunt knew this, and Al started to see the world through her eyes. There's a moment when at all the Schwartz family was gathered at his house, and Al shared that one day he wanted to become Pope. And the whole family laughed, thought it was a big joke, but Al secretly knew he was not joking. As altar servers, little Al's brother Louis said for him, altar serving was just pro forma, but he knew for Al it was not. Lou would later say, I have to say that serving Mass for us may have just been pro forma. It was for me. With Al, you just didn't know. He didn't share in that way. Yet Al's relationship to Mass transformed after his first visit to his aunt. Something in him changed, his brother Lou said, and things weren't pro forma any longer. It was in Sister Melfrieda's presence that Al slowly began to understand God's plan. He wanted to be among the poor, and he wanted to serve them as Christ did. The big thing was, this was the beginning of Al's understanding that he had to be poor to care for the poor. And this idea is going to come as somewhat of a shock to Father Al when he begins to realize that his queen at that time, Sister Melfrieda, even she wasn't practicing authentic poverty. This is how it's explained. Then one day, something unexpected happened. As if a secret room in his conscience were suddenly entered for the first time, he began to believe that Sister Melfrieda and the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur lived too comfortably. Life inside the convent seemed different from the real world outside, Al recalled later. Everything was so immaculately clean, cool, quiet, and comfortable. Even the cold drinks and sweets the nuns gave us tasted different and so much better than we were accustomed to at home. Like, Sister Melfrieda wasn't just not living as the poor as she was serving. She wasn't even as poor as Father Al was living. A suspicion began to rise within him. The sisters' care for the poor seemed to him to be phony. When their days concluded, they returned to a world of relative comfort, whereas the blacks they served and taught came home, just like Al's own parents, to a day-in, day-out struggle to make ends meet. Where once Al saw the romance of his aunt having renounced the world to serve a people who had largely been renounced by society, he wondered whether the Sisters of Notre Dame were really living Christ's call to sell what you possess and give to the poor, and come, follow me. He recognized that the sisters could not be considered rich, but that they could not be considered poor like Christ either. And this is going to be a major theme in Father Al's life. Sister Melfrieda's obituary from September 1959 would actually be very similar to Father Al's own obituary. Her heart went out to her charges, and she gave them the full measure of her devoted love. Sister Mary Melfrieda was a real apostle. She saw Christ in the dusky face of every child she taught and tried to make him realize his dignity as a child of God and a member of the mystical body. Every lesson she taught was impregnated with this one idea. Her little pupils did not have much in the way of worldly possessions, but she wanted to make sure that they would be spiritually rich. It was at this point in Al's life that the Boyhood Commandos are going to step aside, and we're going to now see him begin to read from the Catholic library of martyrs, saints, prophets, lonesome missionaries, and his borrowed and dog-eared books. These lives lit fires in his soul. Just like that, Kevin and Priest and Beggar is going to say, Superman gave way to Blessed Charles de Foucault, and the mysterious Lone Ranger became the mystic St. John of the Cross. Captain Marvel couldn't rescue poor kids the way St. John Bosco could. These sacred new heroes opened for him a vast and deep desire to live like Jesus Christ. As he read the lives of the saints, he saw that many resembled Christ as a starved man, one whose face was beaten and whose body was stained with blood as he gave his life for all, the poor, the rich, and even the riotous Hagars next door. That's a reference to the bullies that lived right next to him. It's just bullies after bullies in his life. I think Father Al enters a high school seminary. This is St. Charles Seminary. He had won, he's a very smart child, top of his class or thereabouts, and he had been given a scholarship to go to a prestigious high school there in Baltimore. No, sorry, he's in D.C. at this time. But he declined it instead to go to seminary. That would have been, scholarship was a big deal for him being in this poor family. It would have been the greatest education any of them had yet received. But he decided instead to go to high school seminary along with his brother Louis. But before, this is a Sulpician seminary. So the Sulpicians were a French, I think even a Parisian order of priests founded by Father Jean-Jacques Odier, who was a disciple of St. Vincent de Paul. St. Vincent de Paul is going to come up a lot in Father Al's story. And like we talked about last episode, he's clearly an influence on Blessed Frederick Ozanam, who founded the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. So it's amazing how St. Vincent de Paul is an influencer of this generation, of subsequent generations of saints. I think I'm going to have to cover St. Vincent de Paul pretty soon as one of the greats. So Al actually demanded assurances from the Sulpician rector of St. Charles Seminary that his zeal for working on the peripheries of society, working with the poor, he'd be allowed to continue doing that. That rector, Father George Gleason, wasn't accustomed to that kind of pluck from incoming students, but he assured Al that part of his vocation would be faithfully supported at the seminary. Al wrote in his diary not long after that he liked St. Charles, but no, it was not a good place to keep alive the spark of his missionary vocation. Nevertheless, one evening at St. Charles, this is Kevin's words, gladiatorial Maryknoll priest of Irish bloodlines, Father Patrick Byrne, came into town like a cassocked John Wayne on horseback. This Father Patrick Byrne was a gifted storyteller, and he told the boys, I'm very excited talking about all his missionary journeys. I could almost do an episode on just Father Patrick Byrne. There's going to be Vincent Lebbe as another great influence on Father Al down the road. That might be another episode as well. We'll see. And reading it about these guys, there's just leads you to so many other great saints. So trying to keep up. Father Patrick Byrne was like the guy, the missionary. He's a Maryknoll missionary who went to Japan after the war, after the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And post-war Japan was a pretty tough place. It's not going to be as tough as post-war Korea, where Father Al's going to end up, but there's a remarkable similarity that he's getting to hear from a missionary to post-war Asia. It's going to be two different wars. This was World War I with Japan, World War II with Japan. It's going to be the Korean War with Korea. But it's funny how God put these people in his life, how God puts people like this in all our lives. Father Byrne's heart had been torn open by the loss of more than 250,000 citizens in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan's soul had been stolen, Father Byrne told them, and its survivors were searching for a new way. And this guy, Father Patrick Byrne, had actually been an alumnus of the same St. Charles Seminary. He had traveled to the Far East 9 years after his ordination in 1915, and he worked tirelessly and successfully, ultimately, to establish Maryknoll's first mission in Korea. Father Al is going to be a great missionary to Korea one day. Just a remarkable coincidence. Within no time, a large population of Catholics and seminarians began to spread across the Korean countryside. After it was flourishing, he headed to Kyoto, Japan, and Japan was not particularly welcoming, but he had great success there too. Father Patrick Byrne was so powerful at winning Catholic converts in the Far East that Pope Pius XII named him a bishop and the first apostolic delegate to Korea. Father Patrick's eventually going to be martyred. After 6 years after he spoke to Al and his classmates in the brutal heat of the summer of 1950, now Bishop Byrne's spreading of Catholicism would catch up with him. He gained attention from the North Korean communists. They imprisoned him and tortured him. He was ordered by a North Korean judge to condemn the United States government and to condemn the Vatican as well. And Byrne is said to have replied, "There remains only one course, that I die." So this is also remarkable because death will not be quick for Father Byrne, just as it will not be quick for Father Al. Communist soldiers marched Bishop Byrne and hundreds of other POWs across what became a blood-stained landscape in the shadow of Korea's snow-covered Gangnam Mountains. In the middle of winter and with virtually no food, water, or warm clothing, many dozens of prisoners died en route. Byrne, who made the 110-mile a pair of thin slacks and a short-sleeved shirt, and along the way he frequently would stop to pray with those who'd fell out of the lines, who just crumpled down in the snow to die, and he would pray with them as the column of people left them to die, maybe even giving them last rites. When after 4 months, Father Byrne staggered with a few dozen other survivors into the North Korean town of Hangjeong-ni, he was asked to perform exercises outdoors in sub-zero temperatures. He, like those he administered to, just crumpled to the ground. He died shortly thereafter of pneumonia. Just before his death on November 25th, 1950, he said to his fellow POWs, "After the privilege of my priesthood, the greatest privilege of my life is to suffer for Christ with all of you." What's remarkable about this brave man's life is also the way that the St. Charles College quickly noticed that maybe they had made a mistake by bringing Father Byrne to talk to all their students, because they all wanted to be missionary priests and not priests of the diocese there or archdiocese in Washington, D.C. So they kind of began a counter campaign to squelch the missionary work. And you see this kind of stuff. Father Al's going to start to see a foreshadowing of how the bishops are going to fight his missionary efforts. So after Father Byrne departed, the Sulpicians, with whip-like speed, initiated what Al saw as a missionary devitalization effort. They delivered a counterattack in the form of a long talk the next evening on the need for local diocesan vocations, and they made the seminarians feel disloyal for a desire to leave the diocese for missionary work. We see this phenomenon throughout the world in a lot of dioceses. Although nearly all recent popes have encouraged missionary work, encouraged bishops to foster missionary vocations, most bishops are just too concerned with the local needs of the church to make anything more than token efforts at missionary work. Father Al would later call this sort of short-sightedness by bishops, he'd call it spiritual birth control. Because I think what he's striking at here is that if you want vocations at home, then you've got to inspire the men, the boys of your home diocese with these missionary tales, or just inspire them, period. And missionary work is extremely inspiring. So it's going to be at this point in his life during his high school seminary that he's going to start to fall in love with Saint Therese of Lisieux. He's going to read Story of a Soul. Maybe it was after this display of this kind of hypocritical display by the bishop that he's going to lose a little of the savor of his vocation in seminary, Father Al, and take part in some pranks. And he's going to be whipped by the head of the seminary with with his shoe. The shoe was notorious in the seminary. And I think the most whips by the shoe that anybody had endured before beginning to cry was like in the 60s. Father Al got into the late 40s before he cracked. But it was an important awakening for Father Al that he was losing sight of his vocation. And so he also found St. Therese to comfort him at this time. And everything pretty much changed after the whipping and then finding Story of a Soul. Father Al was struck by her little way of renunciation. St. Therese of Lisieux, that's her spirituality, the little way. The French saint, with her impulse to embrace hiddenness and the dignity of suffering, with her faithful perseverance in offering unnoticed acts of sacrifice, with her desire for total abandonment to serve God, captivated Al as no other saint ever had. As a 16-year-old boy, Al saw that the substance of her writings is inspired with the fire of the Spirit and the blood of the Lamb. He wrote that in his private journal. He would pray that he would request of his longtime spiritual director in Korea, the Belgian Carmelite nun, Mother Gertrude, he would ask that she pray fervently that Therese herself puts into his heart, his bloodstream, and the very marrow of his bones, what is contained in that. Father Al would ask that for his heart, his bloodstream, and the very marrow of his bones. And I'll put in a link to that book in the show notes. It is certainly an important book. During the course of his life, Father Al would go on to read Story of a Soul more than 24 times, often in St. Therese's original French, and he would also mandate that make it mandatory reading for his sisters, the Sisters of Mary that he'll one day form. As Father Al was dying from ALS in his last days, he asked that the little flower, St. Therese's deathbed conversations be read to him on his deathbed. So, as you might expect for this bold saint, the diocesan priesthood of Washington, D.C. was not sufficient for him. He switches to, I guess that was a minor seminary, and his major seminary is going to be with the Maryknolls. Father Patrick Byrne was a Maryknoll priest. They're an order of missionary priests. Father Al would write in The Starved and the Silent, another of his books, what I discovered was this. Maryknoll was rich, unmistakably so, considering that these students are preparing themselves for an apostolate to the poverty-stricken peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, who are at the opposite end of the economic spectrum. One cannot help wondering if this arrangement is not something less than the ideal. That one should prepare for a life among the poor by living rich struck me as being at least a bit illogical. So that's Father Al writing about he's just not finding an order of, Maryknoll is an accomplished order of missionary priests, but they're not satisfying his desire to also live like those he'd be a missionary to live in poverty. Although he saw the Maryknolls as sort of an Americanization of missionary life, it caused Al an enormous distress. But even so, he continued to thrive in school because that's just what he does. He thrives in the midst of hardships. That's maybe one of his most defining characteristics. Because he's a top student, Maryknoll started to earmark him as a future leader and just one day sit behind a desk as an administrator, and that's not Father Al. As soon as he caught wind of this, Father Al was already finding a new seminary, and so that's what convinced him to leave the Maryknolls. The next order that he's going to ask to enter, he's going to go from the Maryknolls to the SAMists. So SAMist, like the Sam, like Samwise Gamgee, like Summer of Sam, it's an acronym for the Société des Auxiliaires des Missions, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. So it's SAM, and they would call themselves the SAMists. Their home base was in a little country town in Belgium, Louvain. Louvain's now a pretty major seminary and university particularly for people wanting advanced degrees in philosophy. Can't necessarily speak to its orthodoxy, but it certainly has renown even today. Began more or less during Father Al's time. The SAMists proposed what they called a new mission formula, which was right in Father Al's wheelhouse, right what he was looking for. So the idea would be they'd form secular priests who would work with and under native bishops in Africa and Asia. Secular priests meaning they're not in an order of priests. They're not living necessarily in community, but they'd be functioning as diocesan priests. So they would work with and under native bishops in Africa and Asia. The SAMists required of its community of priests to embrace fully the identity of the people they served. They wanted priests speaking the local people's dialect, eating their same food, wearing their same threadbare clothing, Father Al like that, and embracing their customs, poverty, and humble ways. Father Al saw this work as abandoning oneself to live entirely on the fringes of society, a prospect that he deemed romantic, rugged, and most importantly, in line with what had been distinctly mandated to him by God. Those around him thought it was a stupid idea. Sister Melfrieda, she thought it was stupid. Father Al would say, everybody was convinced that I had lost my reason. Everyone. I recalled my aunt, Sister Melfrieda. She had been living for the days of his ordination, and she announced that I was going overseas. And when he announced that he was going overseas, she wrote me a letter. She said, "You are making the biggest blunder of your life." She was considered by the whole family to be wise King Solomon, and that was her advice. So that his family was not happy with this decision. That obstacles are not going to stop Father Al. He leaves for Louvain, for Belgium, with little money he can scrape up. Belgium is going to be a very cold place for Father Al, but there are going to be other obstacles as well. For example, at the school at Louvain, only French and Latin were spoken by instructors in class, and Father Al didn't speak French and only knew Latin for the Mass. As you might expect by this point from learning about Father Al, he quickly learned these languages, caught up with his classmates, and even succeeded them in their own languages. Nevertheless, even though he overcame obstacles, experienced success, he would later share that his first semester at Louvain marked the most psychologically and physically grueling period of his life. He had arrived in Belgium, just like he's going to arrive in Korea later on, when they were still trying to recover from World War II in Belgium. A lot of fighting happened in Belgium in World War I and World War II. And I see that in a little bit with respect to Our Lady of Banneux. Many of the Belgians were heavy-hearted and solemn. A bleakness seemed to blanket the small farming community of Kessel-Lo, where his dormitory was located. I was starry-eyed, and off I went into the wild blue yonder, Al would later put it, only it wasn't blue. It was gray and leaden. But, and this is something Father Al is always going to do, instead of praying to merely overcome this suffering, he's going to pray for more suffering. Took this as a process of purification and perfection. The grueling days of seminary were perfecting him and purifying him. He longed for this, prayed for this. He realized, and he prayed, like I said, for more of this. And he would later say, if I realized that ALS was the ultimate answer to my prayers, I doubt I would have continued to pray for more suffering. But somehow this seems to be exactly what was in my imagination or my prayers over 40 years ago. Is this the workings of extrasensory perception or a mystical experience of grace, or both? I think it's both. But at any rate, years ago I thought I was being prepared for this terrible ordeal. No one, maybe when they're interviewing for his cause for sainthood later, none of his classmates or anyone else heard him ever complain about all the illnesses and digestive issues he suffered while at Louvain. He basically couldn't sleep. His room was too cold, and everything else that comes from never being warm and homesick. The summers he'd have at Louvain were pretty awesome. The warmth of the summers were amazingly contrasted with the cold winters. So he's too poor to fly back home or sail back home to across the Atlantic to America in the summers. So he would just hitchhike and earn his way through Europe. So for a good chunk of his first summer at Louvain, he answered a advertisement for a little parish in the wild countryside of the Provence Alps, Côte d'Azur, in southeastern France. There's a little parish there that needed some help from a seminarian, and he answered the ad and was hired for the summer. He was going to help with parish duties, lend a hand in the village. He was going to assist an aging priest, the Father Dugot, the Abbé Dugot. If Al agreed to work alongside the locals as a steady farmhand, he would receive free accommodations, healthy country fare, a pleasant mountainous climate, and the opportunity to improve his French in a pastoral setting. That sounds wonderful. Al's summer in Baudouin turned out to be one of the most memorable in his life. And most of that was due to living and working with the Abbé Dugot, who to Father Al was a callback, a memory of a French saint. So I just took a second to look it up to see if maybe Ars, where Saint Jean Vianney was, the curé of Ars, the priest of Ars, was near where Baudouin, where Al is spending his summer. No, they're not. I mean, they're both southeast France, but Ars is near Lyon, and Baudouin is closer to the coast. So it's near the mountains and the coast. It had to have been beautiful. But both Al and the Abbé Dugot were drawn to the French saint, Saint Jean Vianney. Also, Kevin Wells, who wrote Priest and Beggar about Father Al's life, just wrote a book coached by the curé. He's also a big devotee, a lover of Saint Jean Vianney. Al would later write of Father Dugot that Father Dugot had asked the bishop for the loneliest and most difficult post in his whole diocese. Father Dugot's house, he lived very poor. You can imagine how this attracted Al. There was no running water. There was just a water pump around the corner of the house, no toilet, just a hole in the ground, no icebox, no radio, washing machine, iron, or any conveniences. They had meat maybe once or twice a week. They ate very simply, but very, very well. Plenty of fresh vegetables and fresh fruit and cheese and bread, which the parishioners very quickly leave on the doorstep of the rectory. I don't know about very quickly. I don't know if they just scamper off, but just reading that and the imagining landscape is making me hungry. I bet there's some other food experiences in Father Al's life that this may have been poor here in France, but it was still probably very tasty. On the curé is the curé Abbé Dugot, not the curé Saint Jean Vianney. The curé is deeply loved by the people. This is still Father Al describing this. He has a terrific reputation as a chiropractor, and people come from miles for his help. On Saturday, when we went down into town, his 1934 rattle trap, which the bishop gave him, he healed 3 different men. I was amazed. One man had a sprained back and could hardly walk, but after the curé worked on it for 5 minutes, he jumped up and down as if he were as fit as a fiddle. Another had a sprained leg and walked away from the curé without limping or without pain. So once his stay at Baudouin with Abbé Dugot ended, Father Al continued hitchhiking through Europe. And it was on this trip they developed a confidence that God would always provide for him, whether it was a place to sleep, a loaf of bread, or an encounter with a particular soul. In reading this, it reminds me, especially the next part I'm about to talk about with the Emmaus Movement, it reminds me very much of Jean Valjean in Les Miserables when he's traveling through France and trying to find work and the prisoners he encounters. But, this is France. But in particular, as Les Mis, the Bishop of Digne, I can't remember that character's name. It's Jean Valjean encounters a generous priest that saves him from having to go back to prison. At some point during this hitchhiking or during his time at Louvain, Al had discovered the unconventional work of a long-bearded, beret-wearing French priest named the Abbé Pierre. Born Henri Grousse. So we've gone from, not to get you confused with abbés and curés, he was staying with the Abbé Dugot, and now he's going to stay at one of these homes that the Abbé Pierre founded. So the Abbé Pierre was a former World War II resistance fighter who founded what came to be known throughout Europe as the Emmaus Movement. This is another great influencer that probably could be another podcast. The Abbé Pierre, surmised that homeless men and women would regain their dignity through their labor and begin to reconnect with society if they were given a job. One unintended effect was that in feeling the euphoria of Lazarus from the grave, many returned also to God, and their dignity was given back to them. All the poor people of Europe following the human devastation of World War II. So the Abbé Pierre created this fundraising movement. This is going to make you think of Father Al too. But he created a fundraising movement to help get the homeless and poor of Europe back to work, and in so doing, back to God. So this movement really got off its feet when the Abbé Pierre gave a speech on Radio Luxembourg on February 1st, 1954. He gave this impassioned call and begging the French people and the government to come to the aid of the homeless during an especially brutal winter that year, 1954. The priest's radio plea generated several $1 million in donations almost overnight. It was reported that the National Postal Service couldn't handle the deluge of letters. He said from the radio, "My friends, help. A woman froze to death tonight at 3 a.m. on the sidewalk of Sebastopol Boulevard, clutching the paper that, just the day before, had evicted her from her home." So, you can see how this will inspire Father Al's future work in raising money for the poor and bringing a whole war-torn country from the brink of annihilation and restoring dignity to the homeless and orphans. So he'd spend Christmas break at this Emmaus community in Paris, I believe. He hitchhiked over to Paris on a moonless Christmas Eve, and as he stood outside the door in a sleeting rain, a whiskey-voiced man beckoned him into a large kitchen warmed by more gruff-talking men, hot food, and a well-tended fireplace. You can just feel this. The description is so good from the author, Kevin. Al's mud-caked cassock dragged across the floor as he headed for a table where a bowl of soup, greasy potatoes, a hunk of cheese, and a glass of, this is my favorite part, vicious-tasting red table wine were set before him. He said, Father Al would later say, it was there that he would go on to celebrate the most memorable Christmas season of his life. Like I was saying before, it reminded me of a scene from Les Miserables. There was Maurice at the table who had one of those hard, leathery, ageless faces, which could have been 55 or it could have been 35. That Frenchman was a murderer and an ex-convict who had recently been forced to the streets of Paris because no employer would take him on as a bricklayer after his release from prison. It's like Jean Valjean couldn't get work because he bore a yellow card of a convict, and it's like parole card, and so eventually will ditch his identity as Jean Valjean. There was also at Mass that night, Jean, a once suicidal laborer who had been living beneath a bridge on the River Seine, and then Philbert, Marcel, Robert, Sharif, Monsieur Saint Vincent, Guillaume, and other hard-luck men also gathered for this Mass. Seemed more like a fireside chat among the dregs of Paris than Holy Mass. The incense of the Mass got lost in the scent of sweat and sawdust burning stove, but to Al, the fragrance was sacred and ambrosial, like the shepherds descending the Bethlehem hillsides, the coarse men in his midst, once gnawed by loneliness, rejection, and the cold of the night, came just as they were and offered just themselves. It's a great scene, this Christmas scene. At one point, a fight breaks out because one of the Italian immigrants gets called macaroni, and it gets the priest head of the Emmaus community, the brother-father, to connect it to the mother-sisters of Sisters of Mary, ended the fight by pouring a pitcher of water over one of their heads. But Father Al worked with them in the bitter cold alongside these homeless men from Paris, the toughest of the tough, former legionnaires, ex-convicts, soldiers of fortune, clochards, which is apparently vagrants, and victims of unhappy circumstances that had been caught up in the mechanism of an impersonal society before finally being cast off as waste products. This reminds me of John Paul II after the Soviet takeover of Poland. They're carrying wheelbarrows of concrete. Reminds me of, I think John Paul II was at a quarry or a concrete factory. So Father Al, after summers and winters and semesters in Europe at Louvain and with the SAMists, he's going to rise to the top of his class again. The cream that is Father Al always rose to the top. But he's going to go too far. Maybe not too far, but it's at least going to cause him maybe he did the right thing, but maybe he was a little imprudent or at least a little self-creation of obstacles. There was the superior general of the SAMist order that was there at Louvain. His name was Father Dieudonné Bourguignon, which it's a tough name. He's just known as Boo at Louvain, so call him Father Boo for short. More on him in a second, but Father Al is going to be inspired to write him a stinging letter. And Father Al is going to be inspired to do this after reading the letters, the correspondence of Father Vincent Lebbe. So Father Al's reading these letters that Father Vincent Lebbe wrote from the Chinese missions. Again, he is constantly providing Father Al with great mentors for exactly the kind of missionary work that he's going to be doing. We had Father Patrick Byrne in Korea and Japan, and now we have Father Vincent Lebbe, who I think might have even gone to Louvain, just as Father Patrick Byrne went to St. Charles College. Father Lebbe was a missionary among the communist Chinese, which it's like he knew going into that martyrdom was going to happen. It's just a matter of time. I might do another podcast on Father Vincent Lebbe. He seems pretty awesome. I'll just briefly mention him right now, give you some highlights. But Father Al saw in Lebbe an embodiment of a missionary life, both temporally aware and deeply spiritual, a crossbreed between the old soldier Ignatius of Loyola and the contemplative John of the Cross. Give you just a taste of Father Vincent Lebbe. The Lebbe stories were passed around seminaries like cups of sugar from one neighbor to another. It's kind of everybody viewed him as kind of a Wild West hero. He's a Wild East hero. Barrel chest, thick horseshoe mustache that flared out when he shook with laughter, which was often. Shaved bald head, kind of like Maximilian Kolbe. Deep interior peace, mastered the native Chinese language of Mandarin, and he just, he feared nothing, just like Father Al. So he entered China. Early 1900s. This was right after the Boxer Rebellion. So in the Boxer Rebellion, it was called the Boxer Rebellion because of the Society of the Righteous Fists or something like that. It was the Chinese felt like their ancestors were imbuing them with this power to overcome the British rule at that time, and overcoming British rule meant slaughtering the Christians. It was a rejection of Christianity in China, and it was human toll on all sides. And Father Lebbe came into this as a Christian missionary, so tough time. Lots of people have been crucified. But after slaughtering the Christians, Chinese communism quickly made China, especially the peasants, for the days of Christianity. Father Lebbe fought a long crusade. Probably the most important work of his life was fighting for native Chinese bishops. That the Chinese would never, the success of missionaries could only go so far if Chinese weren't led by their own Catholic bishops. And he succeeded in that. I think by the time he died, there were a dozen, 2 dozen bishops of Chinese birth in China. But just like Father Lebbe had a martyrdom not unlike Father Patrick Byrne's. They tried to get him to renounce Christianity too, and that just wasn't going to happen. Father Lebbe had been desiring martyrdom from childhood, and even his mom, he told his mom as, I don't know, like 5 or 6 years old, I am going to be a Vincentian, and go to China to be martyred. He said that very young to his mom, and his mom was like, she believed him. So he was captured by the Chinese communists and tortured in 1940. They attempted brainwashing, but that didn't work. So ultimately, they just, after torturing him for weeks, they just threw him into the streets halfway dead. His liver and kidneys soon failed, causing his skin to yellow and his stomach to balloon. As he lay dying in Chongqing in June 1940, squadrons of Japanese planes were dropping bombs outside of his window. And because of his kidneys failing, they said when he was dying, he looked more Chinese than Belgian. His final words to the priests that surrounded his bed were, "If my suffering isn't enough to make saints of you, I'll suffer still more." And Al would often refer to those words during his priesthood as he would suffer for the orders that he founded as he died from ALS. And what's remarkable is that the Chinese government, the communist Chinese government flew flags at half-mast to honor Father Lebbe's death. It was a secular bow to honor a man's will to give all for God and for the Chinese. So Father Lebbe, reading about this man's amazing exploits in China and boldness, Father Al didn't need much of a reason to be bold. He writes a letter to Father Boo. He writes a brutally honest letter to Father Boo about the abuse he had suffered at his hands. Now, a note on Father Boo, because he is kind of a sympathetic figure. He had been tortured by the Nazis. He could have possibly been another Father Lebbe, but he cracked under the torture. His soul had been terribly rattled by hostilities he endured as a prisoner of German concentration camps. He had been part of the Belgian underground resistance fighters in World War II, and he came back from war angry, and his temper, everybody knew about it, his temper was ferocious. And Al had been elected, I don't know if he wanted this position, but he had been elected like the superior student to the superior, senior student to the superior. So he was given the responsibility of passing on the complaints of the boys in seminary, like a student body president, to Father Boo. And Father Boo, maybe today he'd be generous with the request, but the next day he might literally throw Father Al, just still Al at this point, out his door. He was violent and strong temper. And so Father Al sent him a letter rebuking him, saying, so Father Al is writing this on his way to Washington, D.C. to be ordained, where Father Boo is also going to follow him and travel after him to honor this first American to be ordained as a member of the SAMists. But Father Al is saying, no, I don't want you to speak at my ordination. I don't want you to act like you are that the SAMists are this great international order when you have strongly favored, to the detriment of everyone else, all the Belgians, all the local Belgians. So maybe Father Al could have timed this better. Father Boo's going to respond by stopping Al's ordination, writing to the bishop there in Washington, D.C., I think it's D.C., might be Baltimore, that Father Al's crazy and that he lacks mental stability based on the penances he undertook. And so his ordination, Father Al's ordination, is going to be held up because of this. And this is going to be another consistent theme in his life. He's going to have to appeal to the bishop superior of the SAMists. So Father Boo's the superior general of the SAMists, but even there's a bishop he has to answer to, I guess, because, I don't know. That's just a chain of command. And this Bishop Kirchhoff's, is going to be his savior. And this is going to happen multiple other times in Father Al's future missionary work, that local bishops, or he's going to be defamed and calumniated, but he's going to seek a higher authority, and Our Lady is going to help him make a strong connection, have higher authorities intercede for him. So this happens with Bishop Kirchhoff's, the superior major of the SAMists. And the conversation wasn't going well with Bishop Kirchhoff's until Father Al mentioned Our Lady of Banneux, the Virgin of the Poor, which Banneux is a Belgian city. I'm going to get to this in a second, but it was a local apparition of the Blessed Mother that was very dear to Father Al's heart. So some highlights of this apparition of Our Lady of Banneux. So the Virgin of the Poor is going to be Father Al's number one muse, his Beatrice, his everything. It's going to be just have this beautiful Marian spirit. Our Lady of Banneux, you're also going to see little houses like the one, the little Belgian house, a little chapel that was built in Banneux, there's going to be one in every girls' town and boys' town. Our Lady of Banneux, Our Lady appeared to Mary at Becco in 1933 in this little town, Banneux. It's a little Belgian town. It was not even on the map of Belgium, and that was just fine for those in Banneux because at this time, 1933, we're in between the two world wars. And in World War I, the residents of Banneux had agreed, every one of them, to be consecrated to Our Lady so that their town would be saved from World War I. And the Nazis, I think in both World War I and World War II, completely missed Banneux. In World War I, not even a rifle shot was heard from the war that raged all around Belgium. And Belgium was built through the Ardennes forest of Belgium, and the Eastern Front in France was built the Maginot Line. There's a line of fortifications that was supposed to keep Germany out, which it failed. It was a notorious, infamous failure because the German tanks just rolled over it. So many of the major battles of World War I were fought in Belgium. And despite all those miracles, the town had fallen away almost completely from the sacraments when Our Lady appeared to Mary at Becco in 1933. Like with Our Lady of Fatima and Lourdes, it seemed that the Blessed Mother chose Mariette simply because she was poor and had an open heart. So it's not Blessed Mother hardly ever appears to the most intellectual. She appears to children that have an open heart and poor children. That it was a cold night, and Mariette wanted to go outside to search for her brother that had not yet come home. But then a bright ball, like the moon, passed through pine trees and began to move toward the Becco home, gradually taking on the silhouette of an exceedingly beautiful woman. She was a little over 5 feet in height and hovered a few feet above the ground just outside the window. The image looked directly at Mariette, and she was smiling. She appeared as a vision of radiant light, clothed in a white garment above a blanket of snow, where an onion patch would bloom in the springtime. Mariette, there's this moment where Mariette takes her lamp away to see if she's casting a glare onto Blessed Mother. And when she takes the lamp away, she shines the light, the radiance grows. She shines all the brighter. Again, Mariette wants to go outside, but her mother tries to stop her because the mother thinks this is a witch. There's a lot of superstition in the countryside this time because they'd fallen away from the sacraments. They'd probably fallen into other stuff. So maybe the mother wasn't wrong in thinking of some kind of demonic manifestation. But Mary will return 3 days later, and that night is even colder than the night before, and Our Lady draws Mariette to the edge of a deep forest. And all this is symbolic. All the gestures and motions, Father Al will later take these, ponder them in his heart, and find deep symbols. So Mariette is brought to the edge of a deep forest at the Becco's property line. And it's at this point that Mariette's father sees her, races outside to grab his daughter, and stops. He sees her drop like a stone to the ground 3 times. And there Mariette knelt for a while, her gaze fixed at some point above her. Mariette appeared to glow and to radiate light, and she was completely absorbed. And then it says, he watched Mariette kneel by a spring he had never seen before. It was right at the edge of their property. It was a fresh spring that had just come from nowhere like at Lourdes. The father was too afraid to speak when she suddenly plunged her hands into the icy water. He didn't know that she was obliging the command of Mary. Mary had told Mariette, plunge your hands into this water. Plunge your hands into this water. The spring is reserved for me. She kept her hands submerged for a long time. Mariette appeared a few days later and identified herself as the Virgin of the Poor. It's the first time she adopts a title that identifies herself with the poor. She said she had come to relieve the suffering of the poor and broken-spirited, while also calling for unceasing prayers. She always does. And she also asked a small chapel be built for her in Banneux, and this is going to be the chapel that Father Al is going to reproduce in every girls' town and boys' town. So that every girls' town and boys' town is like another Banneux. So from this, there's I don't know, Mary might have spoke less than 100 words in this whole apparition. But from the gestures and the symbols and her words, Father Al is going to develop a whole system and structure for helping the poor. He would piece together a system that would structure his own incomprehensibly fruitful work for the poor. He saw divine significance in Mary's unsubtle request, her command that Mariette plunge her hands into the icy water. He took this as Mary's invitation to enter into Jesus' humiliation fully, to plunge into it, his humiliation and his suffering, as well as an encouragement to do penances, all to convert sinners. Mary's insistence on prayer and the lessening of burdens became the cornerstone of boys' towns and girls' towns, becoming a champion of the poor and fidelity to the poor and broken-spirited. Quote, the message at Banneux would become the raw material to build the the broadest non-government funded service for poor children in history. It's hard to overstate what Father Al would be able to accomplish for the children of the world. So I think this is where we'll end this episode. Looks like this is going to become a two-parter, and then we'll do a third part on just Father Al's passion and death based on that book, Killing Me Softly. We'll end with his ordination. So Father Al would say, in a sense, she was the one who ordained me. After his troubles with Father Boo and his salvation, his being saved by Bishop Kirchhoff is going to make him a priest of his own diocese. He's going to have such an impression on Bishop Kirchhoff, who's the Bishop of Liège, Belgium, that Father Al is going to be ordained a priest of Belgium, of Kirchhoff's diocese. And that at this point he's going to go to Banneux, and he's going to have a mystical moment there that he never really describes. And maybe that, and I asked Kevin Wells about that. I'm like, doesn't that bug you that we never got details on that? He's like, no, I think that's right. It was an intimate moment between Father Al and the Blessed Mother. But Father Al did say a couple things. He said, in a sense, she was the one who ordained me. He wrote, she puts her hands on this child and blesses this child. To the bishop, Our Lady did this to me. So that mystical moment he's going to have with Our Lady is going to take on the form of his ordination. Father Al will later say, Mary of Banneux chose me at an early age, just as she erupted in the night in the life of Mary at Becco. She suddenly appeared in my life without any preparation. She brought me to Belgium, where I discovered her. I never heard of Banneux before then, so my priesthood in a special way belongs to Our Lady of Banneux. My apostolate is hers, and I would like to be buried at her feet and say that all praise, glory, and honor for anything good accomplished in my life goes to her and her alone. In all the fights and obstacles and bullies that he's going to encounter in the next phase of his life in Korea, in the Philippines and Mexico, she is going to be his safe port, and amid those stormy seas and storms. And then 2 podcasts from now, when we'll talk about his road to Calvary and his fight with ALS, or his death from ALS. His last words will involve his Beatrice, his muse, Our Lady of Banneux. In his very last hours, Father Al will call out to her, whispering aloud to the Sisters of Mary who surrounded him, the Virgin of the Poor has been working with me since the beginning. She does not need me anymore. Father Al's brother Louis will say he offered Our Lady of Banneux his entire priesthood. I guess that's about as pure as it gets. So we'll end this podcast with those very beautiful words. Our Lady of Banneux, pray for us. Venerable Aloysius Schwartz, pray for us.